Cancella's Conference, Day 2, Talk 3.
So anyway, I wanted to introduce myself. I can't remember. I can't remember. I wanted to because I was in Berlin. We never had it. I was very as I say, it was just as well because I thought Berlin, I'd like to respond to you. My work. I don't know. I have one child, and I have to apologize. Each also so each year, I get all this stuff. I'm very sorry.
Right, I don't coming back.
I'm quite interested in history. We've been working on my reading. I like your question. I wanted to talk to Steve about He's got clearly has views.
Dan, are you here by car? Are you here by car? No. Yeah, but it's on the
Sure. I know. I've been watching you.
Thinking about his answer.
Carl? Are you playing something you do?
All good, Mike. I hate when I lose these nice chances.
I'd like to. Okay. Well, it's just I would love to. Unfortunately. So this comes up here. Bestimmt wieder ein Band. Yeah, well, I think it's right. I didn't know we that gets 2 hours and more than let's comment. Yes, I know. And then further about
all right, so let's get started. Welcome to the last session of the day. Our presenter is Matt Boyle, Harvard University. He's going to be presenting on Kant and McDowell on the spontaneity of judgment.
Thanks. Okay, right. I'll keep this brief. I mean, this paper grew out of an interest in connection. McDowell. Right, grew out of McDowell. It's true. Although I'll say a word about that in a minute. So right, it grew out of an interest provoked by John McDowell and by Kant in the connection between three ideas which a long tradition associates. One, the idea that our minds are rational in some special way. The other, that we are self-conscious in some distinctive sense, and the third, that our power to know is active in some distinctive sense. Those three ideas I take to be closely connected in Kant's thinking. Our power of cognition is power of understanding. Here I mean the understanding in general, the faculty that comprehends reason, judgment, and the understanding proper, the faculty of concepts. and that understanding in general is characterized by, I take it, self-consciousness and spontaneity. These are tantalizing ideas that these three features of our cognitive life are intimately connected. I think you can get attracted to them in ways that don't go through Kant. I try to make a case for that in the paper. I won't try to make it here. But at any rate, you might think that Kant is one of the most interesting guides we can find in the history of philosophy to the relationship between these ideas. I'm interested in trying to understand in what sense he thought that our power of cognition was spontaneous, the sense in which that was connected with its capacity for self-consciousness, and the ways in which those properties of our power of cognition are connected with what's possibly thought of as our rationality. And the paper proceeds by looking at two recent, relatively recent, it's now some time since they were each in print, relatively recent attempts to make something of these Kantian connections. First John McDowell's and then Henry Allison's. The kind of view in McDowell that in John that I have in mind is the appropriation of Kant's doctrine of spontaneity with the following kind of gloss. Our power of cognition is spontaneous in as much as we are not merely saddled with certain cognitive postures. We can, as it were, step back and reflect upon them, thinking, I judge thusly, and making up our minds as to whether that judgment is sound or unsound. In the paper, I criticized that picture. I should say something. I think that this is to my mind, at least, a superficial feature of John's discussion and the way that he employs the concept of spontaneity. It belongs, I'm thinking, to the stage setting for his talk about spontaneity rather than to the substance of his talk about spontaneity. It's the way that he, as it were, gets you into the frame of mind where you can receive the substance of his discussion. Nevertheless, I think that the stage setting is worth thinking about, in as much as we're interested in the connection between the three ideas I mentioned at the outset, where our power of cognition is active, our power of cognition is self-conscious, our power of cognition is in some distinctive way rational. So it's worth pausing over these initial introductory moments. The paper is really written in response to my own attraction to those ways of talking and my own reconstruction of what they might mean. A reconstruction which I, for a long time, felt very attached to and eventually came to think I couldn't continue to accept. And I try to elaborate some grounds on the one hand of a textual kind and on the other hand of a systematic kind for thinking that this idea of stepping back and making up our minds is not the right one to invoke in clarifying whatever sense it is in which our power of cognition is spontaneous in a distinctive way. Henry Allison also offered an interpretation of these topics. It's an interpretation which appeared around the same time as John's book, I believe. It's not specifically directed against John, but it seems to me to be in a significant way distinct from John's reading, at least in regard to these formulations in John's work. The Allison interpretation has it, as it were, that the exercise of our power of spontaneity resides not in our capacity to step back from and alter our cognitive condition, but in the very obtaining of that cognitive condition. He thinks that the real underlying core of the idea that our power of cognition is self-determining can be brought out by saying that the kind of representing that is cognition for us is a kind of taking as, where you only take X as F insofar as you're aware of taking X as F. So he sees a close connection between this apperception condition on our judging and the idea that we are active in cognition. Again, I won't try to reconstruct this view here. I do it in the paper a little bit, and although I find it in some ways more promising than the stepping back picture, I also think that there's some crucial unclarities in it. Exactly how to clarify the connection between this thought that our acts of cognition are necessarily apperceived and the idea that our acts of cognition are in some distinctive way spontaneous or active, and also just how to spell out this idea that our acts of cognition are necessarily apperceived. One of the things I take it that makes John's approach, the stepping back picture, attractive is the thought that it's not all the time that we actively take concern with our own beliefs, right? The reflection is only an occasional enterprise. I mean reflection not in some technical Kantian sense, but in an ordinary sense, right? It's a relatively rare occasion that I think about my own beliefs or judgments at all. And so you can see the attraction of elaborating whatever connection there is between self-consciousness, activity, and rationality by confining it to certain paradigmatic moments where we step back. Allison's view seems to depart from that, but insofar as it does, whatever its other attractions might be, we should want to know, what can it mean to say that all of our knowing is necessarily apperceived? And in what sense does that make it spontaneous? So I raise some questions about that and then proceed to try to bring to bear some Kantian thoughts about judgment in shedding further light on the matter, in particular the thought that judgment is a form of synthesis, the idea that acts of synthesis rest on a kind of nonsensible or are guided by a nonsensible principle, and the idea that this guidance gives rise to a specifically active way of knowing our own judgments. All of that is just meant to jog memories for people who were able to read the paper. It doesn't really elaborate the ideas in its own right. But anyway, that was the enterprise, and I'll just stop.
Okay, thank you. Given that Kant and McDowell are the two figures named in the title of Matt's paper, and Kant isn't here, I think it's fitting that well, you have equal billing with Kant, so second billing. Okay, second billing. But up on the marquee.
Okay, the main thing I want to say is I think we should spend almost no time talking about me. I mean, Matt uses me along with Henry Allison as a foil in order to put forward a positive or a sketch, right? A positive account of the connection between the three notions. The first thing I want to say, and I guess this is the most important, is that the conception of making up one's mind that I played around with is not Kant's conception of judging. That's exactly right. I mean, all of that stuff in ways I used to talk has nothing to do with Kant, and you know, I'm kind of ashamed that I stuck it onto Kant. I think I've mended my ways. I'm not doing it anymore. That should just go away. It's not getting at anything in Kant. But having said that, and again, I don't think we should spend time on this, but I do have to say I feel a bit, I don't know, something like hard done by. And there are things that strike me as wrong in your beating up on me, independently of your being quite right. about this having nothing to do with Kant. So maybe I'll say a couple of things, and I do hope that they won't fill up the discussion. Then I would like to say something to get at the proper discussion, which should be of Matt's sketch of a positive way to think. But first, just try to reconstruct why I thought as I thought. Section 15 of the critique, I think this is it. All combination is an act of the understanding, and that's Verstandes Handlung. And also in the vicinity there's Actus, which is Germanized Latin. And my thought was, look, if act in act of the understanding is just actualization of a capacity, then there isn't enough here in this picture, act of the understanding, to make sense of why it seems so right. This is your question, really, why it seems so right to call the understanding a capacity of spontaneity, which sounds this note of freedom. And that kind of motivated, I mean, if you think about it, passive capacities have acts in that sense, actualizations. The bottle is movable, that's a capacity the bottle has. I just produced an actualization of that capacity. It was moved. So if that's all that act is doing, the question, why should we call this capacity a capacity of spontaneity, is left untouched. So wouldn't it be a good idea, here was the motivation, to look for something that was more palpably active, that we could conceive as an act, now in the kind of logical sense of that capacity. And I came up with the story about making up one's mind. And here's the first kind of complaint about maltreating me. In your pushing the perfectly correct line that this is not what Kant means by judging, you tend to background, you did it again in your introductory remarks, efface the fact that I don't just acknowledge, I insist that believing as such is an act of that capacity.
Yes.
Right? And that's not, that doesn't disappear in the context of this sort of useless for thinking about Kant attempt to I don't know, tell a story that makes it intelligible that the capacity is a capacity of, in some sense, freedom. There's a note of freedom sounded by talking about spontaneity. So that felt unfair. The other thing that felt unfair was the argument on page 9 and 10, if people are thinking about that my idea of an act that's kind of more obviously an active act than just actualization of capacity, whether it's an active capacity left yet to be further determined. An act that conforms to that specification and that initiates believing is somehow mysterious, maybe incoherent, I mean really bad anyway. This isn't the first time we've had this to and fro. I have never managed to be convinced by you that there's something wrong with the picture on the lines that I was using. So conceive believing as such, as having your mind made up, that might sound too much like a state. You've got to fix it so that there's more activeness in there, but something on those lines seems all right. Now here's a thought. One way to come to have your mind made up, say on some weather question, is to make it up. Making up your mind on a weather question. That's a process that terminates in, and now we have the same name, it terminates in making up your mind on the weather question. For instance, making up your mind that P if the whether question was whether be. And now it's innocuous to say when you perform this act, which is the terminus of the process, when, as soon as, then you believe that be, and from then on out, until and unless you change your mind. I mean, the structure is kind of like the structure of a thing you might say about being at a place. One way to come to be at a place is to go there, which is a process, going there, which terminates in an act, getting there, right, reaching the place. And as soon as you've reached the place, you are at the place. Well, if you, that would be a kind of peculiar purpose of process if you didn't stop at the place, but think of a case where as soon as you've reached the place, you're at the place. So for a little stretch thereafter, you're at the place. That looks okay. A process whose culmination terminus is an act that now initiates, that was my language that you think is awful, a stretch of being at the place. And it's hopeless for various purposes as a full analogy because there isn't a active component in the idea of being at the place. But yeah, I don't know, why not? But anyway, I really don't want that to be the focus, because I think the focus ought to be the positive story. And to kind of start something about that, synthesizing. This was Thomas's topic yesterday. There's that in intuiting too, right? In fact, the remark, all combination is an act of the understanding, is opening into it, having things to say about intuiting. It's not really clear that intuiting conforms to the interesting specifications. I mean, the synthesizing power of the spontaneous understanding is in act in intuiting. But it's not clear that intuiting is something for which we're responsible in some interesting sense. Something in respect of which we are vulnerable to some counterpart of Anscombe's why question. So I kind of wonder whether you are vulnerable to a kind of counterpart of the objection that you pose against Alison. Self-consciousness won't do it because sensations can be essentially self-conscious, meaning what it is for the likes of us to feel a sensation has its character, its constitutive character, consisting in the fact that we feel our sensations self-consciously. So that's why Alison's work with self-consciousness doesn't answer your question. Synthesizing doesn't seem to either. If Thomas is right, surely Thomas is right. I mean, that was the topic of our final session yesterday.
So I don't know where to start. There are lots of things I'd like to respond to, but maybe the thing I should do is start with the final thing, as you suggest.
I hope that that's all we and that and similar things, right? Sort of,
take away the
said my piece about my role in your paper.
Yes.
That shouldn't be what we talk about.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, of course, I'm the one who's been accused of hard doing, and there's some temptation to justify myself, but and to apologize, but but maybe I'll come back to it. I mean, I do think that the second of the two responses to the second of the two issues about feeling hard done by is not merely important to my, putative criticism of you, but to my own thinking. So, and maybe that it's necessary to say something about that, just in its own right. But I don't know. Start with the interesting. I accept and think Thomas is absolutely right to emphasize that that there's a sensible synthesis by which intuition is constituted as a unity for cognition, and right. So I would be sorry if the things that I say in this paper rule that out, or in order to accommodate it, you have to say other things and not the things that I say. Let me just begin by saying what I was thinking was insignificant. I was thinking, in order to appreciate the sense in which judging, as Kant means that term, is an act of our cognitive power, it's helpful as a first step to appreciate the fact that judging is not merely a thumbs up or thumbs down to a proposition,
but giving you that,
but in advance. Okay. So well, so this is the application of the idea
to do with Kant. Well, that may be extreme, but making up one's mind, as I tried to put it in place, I'm giving up on the idea that that somehow captures what Kant means by judging.
Fine. The only reason, John, that you figure here is because you're the only one who invoked Kant in connection with these ideas. I would far rather. I think that the things that you said at this time in 1994 or whatever are things that people in the flush of mind persist in saying all over the place. Not everybody invokes Kant when they say them. I think they're worth making a little fuss about. So really, the dispute is not with you, but a lot of discussion of the activity of judgment. Retains this idea that judgment is the affirmation of proposition, which is a item which has its being as a whole, independent of its being affirmed. The first step in coming to terms with the Kantian picture of judgment, I think, is to think of I learned this, I think, from Steve's work. Start with the idea of a cognition embodied in the case of categorical judgment, in the subject term of the judgment, and the idea that we further determine that by synthesizing the concept of an object embodied in the subject term with a further concept which determines that object. So it was under the heading of that I was interested in, or with a view to bringing that out, that I was interested in synthesis, and then I was interested in this idea, which I think various remarks in Kant suggest, that acts of synthesis as acts are available to apperception in a special way, right? Kant draws this distinction between pure and empirical apperception. Empirical apperception is grounded in our possessing a faculty of inner sense. It is a awareness of our own representations that we have, not through determining them, but through being determined in our cognitive power by them, I suppose. Pure apperception is a different mode, I take it, of awareness of representing. One that is, Kant says, grounded in spontaneity. So I was interested in exploring this idea that there's a mode of awareness of certain representations that is active in character, where that qualifies the character of the awareness that we have. I was thinking that applied in general to synthesis. Now, you rightly bring up that this activity, synthesis, is present in the constitution of a manifold of sensible representations as an intuition, something that we can judge about. Must I, in order to admit that, take back these thoughts about the active character of our knowledge of our own synthesis? I don't see it right off the bat. There's a difficult thought here in Kant, right? That even in the material that experience supplies to us for cognition, there is an aspect of our own activity that we can distinguish only through careful reflection. An aspect that we know not through being affected, but through ourselves being the ground of the relevant determinacy. I don't think that everything I say about the way in which that point applies to judgment will apply to intuition, but I think that that's consistent with the general formula applying to intuition. It's an interesting topic for work in a Kantian spirit, how to fill out the formula in the case of intuition. So I feel the need to say more, but I don't feel knocked over by that concern. Let me say, I should stop and let other questions appear. But just to say one thing about, I think this is a discussion worth having over the second of your two complaints about my representation of you. You said, of course, there is such a thing as engaging in a process of coming to have a view on some topic. At the end of it, you have come to have a view. And insofar as I am seeking to the mere observation that is so, out to be foolish or problematic or something like that, I'm doing something.
But you're leaving out that the label for the process is
making up your mind.
Palpably activity implying, right? Making up your mind. It isn't just coming to have a view. No doubt that happens from time to time. You come to have a view, but making up your mind is a right. It's a kinesis. It's an active kinesis. It aims at And now it's quite nice, I think, that what it aims at, the same words fit, understood with perfective aspect. What engaging in the process aims at is making up your mind, perfective aspect. And as the activity is palpable, and it's unproblematic. But when you make up your mind, perfective aspect, your mind is made up. So the idea that there's some mystery about the idea of an active, purposive process, right? A purposive activity that initiates, stretches of having your mind made up. That seems just wrong.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, you speak as if making up your mind were this concept that appeared and throughout the history of philosophy. It does, I mean, right, it's a newfangled phrase. I agree. I mean, there is, of course, no one should deny, that, somebody could say, I don't know what. Do you think that there'll be any happy outcome of the Syria peace process? Probably this is not. It's too obvious to be a case for us, but I could say, let me think about it, right? And I could, read the newspaper and try to think about other historical cases and so on. I would there be doing lots of things that are purposive, with a view to having a conviction on the question, what's going to be the outcome of this, supposed peace process. Right. I would be doing lots of things that are purposive. It seems to me that none of those things would be what I take it making up your mind in a lot of philosophical idiom is supposed to be. Namely, I mean, people will use making up your mind for the act of judgment. That is to say, not the seeking out relevant information, right, etc., but the drawing, the conclusion, right? The thing I think is that there is no kinetic activity of that kind. All activity of taking such and such evidence to justify such and such a conclusion, or what have you, right? It's causality, its error of determination, its activity, whatever you want to call it, is at a time, and perhaps persisting, not over time, not right. This process that we've envisioned, the process of sorting out my views about Syria, the prospects for peace in Syria, it is a process in which I do lots to facilitate cognition, right? That is purposive and kinetic. But the cognizing, I think, is always non-kinetic. There are lots of hands, so here we go.
Okay, so we're going to use the tried and true finger and hand system. So Irad, add a finger up.
Well, just a point about the history of philosophy. I mean, making up your mind. This is for the sophists. Thinking appears to be the sole conversation with itself. Believe the conclusion of thinking. And this is, you have a process. And but this is kind of reformulated in different places in Plato. So you have precisely this kinetic and making up your mind, so to speak.
I don't accept that that's a kinetic I don't know, whatever. This term is not clarified.
No, just the point about history.
I just don't think that quotation cuts any ice in this dispute. It says something we both grant and have different interpretations of.
I really do want to shut up quite soon, but
Good luck with that.
First I want to
make up your mind.
I think something that's really moving you, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, is a thought which I think is dead right, that there's no space between consciousness of a candidate thing to believe as to be believed and believing it. Mm-hmm. And you can spell out consciousness of a candidate thing to be believed as to be believed. In terms of something like consciousness of whatever, a bunch of evidence, I mean, if it's that kind of belief, as, right, such as to display this candidate thing to believe as to be believed. There's no gap there. Mm-hmm. I can't see a ground for refusing to accept that there is an intelligible concept of a purposive activity that aims at having that be true of you. I don't see why
I agree that there is such a
sort of thing that you envisage doing. The question arose, right? Might there conceivably be peace in Syria? Well, let me think about it. Read newspapers or whatever. I mean, you're aiming at and this isn't going to be temporal. What you're aiming at is being conscious that there can't be is to be believed, or that there might be is to be believed. And this is a horrible example, but and what you do is I can't see, but you say it isn't kinetic. Yes, the act isn't. But I can't see what could be wrong with thinking of the act, the resolution, as the aimed at terminus of a process. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like just you say, well, no, it's not.
No, I say it is. I mean, or can be. That was what I was meaning to grant in granting that. I mean, I could undertake to have a view about the Syria question.
Yeah.
Right. Of course. What I denied the existence of was an act of making it the case that this is my view. That is something other than just believing that there will be peace in Syria, or there won't be peace in Syria. Right? I mean, the people who talk about making up your mind, they don't merely have in view the extended process of trying to educate myself, supplying myself with more information, etc. Characteristically, they focus on something called judgment, which, in your words, I mean, was something that's supposed to result in belief. And so I try to confront this result with a dilemma. Either the judgment can only be made, you can only judge that P in as much as you believe that P. In that case, results is not the appropriate language. Right. A judgment doesn't result in believing if, in order to judge, you must believe. Option 2, judging does not presuppose believing that P. I think, first of all, that should strike us as obscure. Right? It is judging that P isn't just inwardly intoning P. It's inwardly intoning with conviction. What does that mean? Inwardly intoning in the acceptance that P is true, i.e., in the belief that P. Furthermore, if there were such a thing as judging which did not require believing that P, then acting on myself by way of that seems to me like self-manipulation. I shouldn't do that. I should give that up.
David?
I had trouble with the same spot, so I'm thinking maybe a way to help me with the trouble would be to actually look at the text at the bottom of 9.
Okay.
And then when I read it, and this has to be the wrong way to read it, but when I read it, I heard in my mind, there's an argument, a dilemma, that has this term, judging the P and believing the P. So I tried it with making a sandwich and having a sandwich. Mm-hmm. So I'll paraphrase and tell me where the difference exactly is. So the second sentence there in that bottom paragraph. If making a sandwich does require having a sandwich, if at the moment when I make the sandwich I must already have this, I must have the sandwich, then it seems that I cannot make the sandwich because the sandwich is already. If my act, skipping ahead, if my making the sandwich presupposes that there's already a sandwich there, then I can't make a sandwich. On the other hand, if making a sandwich doesn't, so on the other hand, in this case, making a judgment after the next paragraph, what about the other option on which making the sandwich does not require having a sandwich? It just seems so strange. It just seemed like, well, this is how the terminus is. It's not, when I do the thing, I don't yet have the sandwich. But doing the thing leads to the sandwich. And you seem to be asking, in effect, again, I'm sure I'm misreading it, but you seem to be asking, look, when you make a sandwich, do you have a sandwich or not? And then if I say no, you say, well, then you're not really making a sandwich, if there's no sandwich there. And when I say yes, you say, well, what are you making a sandwich for? You already have a sandwich. And I want to say, no, it's precisely neither of those, right? This is all leading toward making a sandwich is what terminates in having a sandwich. So it seemed like you were... the form of this argument just seemed to show that I couldn't do much of anything. And I felt like I had to be misunderstanding it. So I just feel like maybe you could help me by seeing exactly how it's different from making
That's cruel, David.
I've seen David. He can't make a sandwich.
Okay, so there we go.
You can never trust what he has. This guy especially.
No, this dilemma could be raised for any arbitrary, active verb with an object, I guess. In many cases, one of the horns would have no point, right? I think it is perfectly possible to embrace that making a sandwich does not require having a sandwich, right? So there's no problem.
At the
right.
end,
there's
got to be one there at the end. It doesn't.
There has to be one at the end when the making a sandwich has disappeared, right? The making a sandwich is Arya Kaufman wonderfully says that kinesias are kamikaze accusations, right? They annihilate themselves, right? Once this sandwich is made, this making of a sandwich is gone, right? So yes, in general, you can ask, does it or does it not require the thing that is its object? In many cases, there's a perfectly happy option, right? My dilemma only applies where neither option is happy, and I try to argue that neither option is happy here. It sounds like the horn whose point you're having.
When I'm making up my mind, I never stop making up my mind. When I'm making up my mind, the end state is still making up my mind.
Sorry, we were focusing on judging, right? Let's not. I don't have a quarrel with this long, right, enterprise of coming to a view, right? What I have a quarrel with is the idea of a moment, which people, I think, often think of as we're inwardly saying, where I decide it, and decide it means not merely I express a decision, but by so doing, right, by inwardly intoning, or perhaps by outwardly intoning, I make it the case that this is what I believe. My dilemma is intended to be a dilemma for the possibility of such an act. Right? The longer term, I mean, if you want to use judging for, the hemming and hawing, then fine. I don't want to argue about the possibility of that. I want to argue
about. It just seems like the form of the argument then in the paper is odd. It just seems like you shouldn't give me this dilemma about judging and believing. You should say, here's a particular picture of judging. It's judging as simply saying inwardly P, and I want to say that can't be what judging is. It just seems like a confusing way to formulate that in terms of this dilemma.
Okay. I feel like I wish I could go for a show of hands to the audience. Thank you, John.
I'm with you.
Well, no, I mean,
You got Jonathan. You got everything you want.
there is in contemporary philosophy of mind. I mean, I think the idea of the identification of judgment as something like a moment in consciousness where I say, it is P, right? Not the. I mean, you could use judging, and I think it's an earlier use of the term, really. I mean, to talk about the prolonged process of assessing, but the making the assessment, the terminal point is the thing that contemporary philosophers characteristically call judgment. I'm meaning to raise questions about whether, if you think that believing is not an act, you can get activity into the picture by finding it at that terminal point. Okay. So I'm right. I should say more. Jim?
Yeah, so I want to go back to the initial exchange between John and Matt and see if I can put things in a way that everyone will be happy with. And I'm a little more worried about John on this side of the equation, but we'll see how it goes. I mean, here's a thought that's very important in Kant, I take it. Maybe let's bring it out. It seems to be connected to things that we're saying. But it seems to be important for Kant that the thing he's interested in under the title of judgment that you're trying to get clear about is not something that has temporal parts. So the judgment, that can be true or false and so forth, this exercise of my spontaneous capacity is not something which I can think of the expression of the judgment as having temporal parts. I can think of it as being expressed by sentence, and I can utter a quarter of the sentence, and I can utter half the sentence, and I can utter 3/4 of the sentence, 75% of the way through the judgment. But the thing that interests Kant is the judgment. It's not something which I can think a quarter of and then think a half of and so forth. The kind of unity is such that, if we don't have the right part-whole relation, we don't have any of the parts, right? There isn't anything which is, thinking half a judgment or judging half a judgment. So this is a feature of, other features of judgment in Kant. It doesn't have temporal parts. I think you're right that one can judge at a time. But the judging itself, in the thing that we're interested in here, is not something that is kinetic in the sense that it unfolds in time, and we can speak of its temporal parts. Now, there are various other processes, like, coming to a judgment about whether, intervention in Syria is justified. And you can say to me, Jim, you've got to come to a judgment about that. The meeting's tomorrow. And then I do. And that process, is kinetic in the way John was describing. It does have imperfective aspect, hopefully culminating in perfective, and it does have temporal parts. We can think of the manifolds of that process and say various things about it. And what seems to me right is that, and the word making up one's mind seems really well designed, and I think you're right to kind of zero in on this, as a word to hide a philosophical confusion. Because, it's both the term that I think actually its most natural home is, I think John's kind of right about this actually, just in my ordinary language here, is for the thing that has the kinetic grammar. But it is something that philosophers also draw on to kind of understand what judgment is. there's ways of speaking about judgment also, so that you can say, well, judgment's advancing from a truth, from a thought to its truth value. What's that? Well, we model that on a question and then coming to an answer to the question. Well, if I have a question, I don't yet have an answer. There's time t when I have the question. There's time t2 where I do have an answer. Then there was some process from getting one to the other. And then if judging is thought of as the transition from, going from the question to the answer, I am modeling it on a kinesis. And so I do think there's ways that philosophers talk about judgment. And the phrase making up one's mind, that's, is also, I think, nicely designed for unclarity here. So we try to sort of, think something that has this kinetic grammar, something whose unity is of a process that has temporal parts. At the same time that we're trying to understand something, whose unity is such that though it's at a time, the part-whole relation is not one of, the temporal parts of something to, a certain kind of structured temporal whole. And that equivocation surely leads to tremendous confusion. And I think you're right that the thing that Kant is essentially interested in judgment in the first instance. And if we understand how it's a spontaneous activity, the thing that's spontaneous, self-productive, and so forth, is the thing that doesn't have a kinetic grammar. But it seems to me so one needs to separate these different notions. I don't think that's any reason either to, deny that even in ordinary language, some of these words travel around in ways that make some phrases, rather than others, ones that are perfectly suited to quite such confusion. So it doesn't have to stipulate that, if what it means is the one thing, then there isn't a possible use of the expression, which doesn't mean the other thing. All you need to say is there isn't anything which is meaning something that combines these logical features in one thing, and you've meant that. That's a confusion. That seems like the crucial thing you need to say, and one can say that while being more tolerant about ways of speaking that might go all the way back to Plato without that being a problem for you.
Right. I agree with that. Thanks. I mean, of course, the words, we can use them in whatever way we like as long as we use them coherently. So the language of, making up your mind that I was assuming was this, that when you undertake to settle a question, what you're doing up until the moment when you settle it is deliberating, and then at the end you judge or equivalently make up your mind. I was taking it that that's the characteristic philosophical usage. People now want to use making up your mind, as I'm hearing it, for the entire process of deliberation leading to the result. Fine, I have no desire to argue for the impossibility of that. One thing I would say, you said judgment doesn't have temporal parts, and I think that is right. It brings out an important feature of judgment, but it doesn't yet distinguish it from finishing a race, finding something. Right? They're essentially instantaneous acts. I think judging is not. Yeah,
my thought here is that the concept of saying it's all at once, makes it sound like there is a temporal category that has application, whereas I'm thinking temporal categories don't have application here. The at once is a metaphor for a different kind of combination. But I wasn't trying to get a great feature there. I was just trying to say a little more about it so we can see it has different logical features from the other things, so we can see how we can distinguish two things, but we can't. There isn't anything which is thinking together, and I think you're right that a lot of philosophers, inspired by things Frege says, whatever Frege meant by them, want something which has the character of a kinetic transition and want to be sort of engaging Kant's topic at the same time. And that's going to be quite confusing. That strikes me as quite right. But it seems like both sides could agree that that's confused if we could find a way to regiment our vocabulary.
You raised the question whether I could agree, and the answer is sure, yes. But my beef with Matt was he said, look, this isn't what Kant means by judging or by urteilen. And furthermore, there is no way to make any sense of a concept, which we better not call judging, because that'll just confuse the issue. It'll make it look as if it's meant to have something to do with Kant. But there's no room for a concept that has the kind of temporality that the concept that I wrongly stuck on to Kant.
And I was trying to get Matt to not say that, but just to say it can't be.
The furthermore bit strikes me as off in the kind of way that David is pointing to. It's as if on the first horn of the dilemma you said something like, I can't get to be at a place by arriving at it, because the idea of arriving at a place presupposes that I'm already there. Not already. I arrive at an instant, and at that instant, sure, I'm there. So the already is just wrong if we're talking about this completely other topic. So right, the and furthermore bit.
I was trying to get what Matt wants to say to change. So insofar as you want any of these logical features, you can't combine it with any of those. But that's consistent with the same word in our language could actually be used to pick out phenomena have these very different kinds of features. I think that's probably true about English, and I suspect even ancient Greek. And that's interesting and probably not a coincidence, but
I have 4 fingers on the cue, and I asked the finger people to keep it finger length. Okay, Stephanie.
I retreated the finger, but I don't retreat my hand.
Okay. Michael.
Mine was a hand, not a finger.
Oh, yours finger. Michael.
Well, I think it's a finger. I don't know. I don't know the system. I'm sorry. It's related to what we've been talking about.
Well, just try and we'll see. We'll see.
Well, this is
finger
partly
hand.
on this topic and partly maybe opens up other things. But
that's a hand.
First,
Go ahead.
First of all, I wonder. It seems to me, Jim said that the natural home of making up your mind is one thing, but it seems to me actually the natural home of making up your mind involves doing something. Make up your mind to do something, and that's a case where there is something. There's an action at the end, right, which is separate from the process in some sense, right? Deliberation results in your acting, and this relates to a question that I puzzled about when I read Mind and World. And I'm not sure about what you think, but that's really basically just this. Is there a difference between spontaneity and freedom of the will? In Mind and World, it felt to me an awful lot like spontaneity of the understanding just was freedom of the will. In some sense. There's responsibility, there's talk of freedom, explicitly. There has to be a difference. And one thing I want to just note, I don't know much of the history of this term. German philosophers here can help me. But Leibniz talks about spontaneity in the Discourse on Metaphysics and talks about spontaneity as something that's possessed by any creature.
It's definitely a hand, Michael. Not a
one more word. He says it's raised to the level of freedom in rational creatures. Anyway, what does the point about making up your mind connects to all of that? I think, right? If making up your mind is ultimately something practical, if that's the paradigm case of making up your mind, then there's a case, a possibility of a different kind of hiding of something under it than what Jim was talking about.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. In Kant, spontaneity, I take it, is a more generic idea of which practical freedom is a specific determination. And Kant says that the real moment of difficulty in the concept of freedom lies in spontaneity. Spontaneity, abstractly understood, is supposed to be, I think it, he'll also use Selbsttätig, right? It acts not as a result of being determined by something else, but through determining itself. And maybe a version of that idea applies to life in general, but at any rate, a special version of it applies to the understanding, I think I never took John to think that the idea of making up your mind that he wanted to invoke was connected with the will, and I don't take that to be, I mean, insofar as we're wanting to use that kind of contemporary idiom to talk about Kant on the spontaneity of the understanding, we want to dissociate it from any question of will or choice. I mean, it seems right to say, as many philosophers have said, that we do not believe at will. Right. That whatever is the character of the self-determination in believing or judging, that it is not judging in as much as we will so to judge.
But
Yeah,
this
sorry.
is a way of getting at maybe your point that could get past David's argument in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's the case that...
I already got past David's argument.
Well, no. I mean, it seems to me the situation is one where on one horn of the dilemma, right, you don't have to believe to make up your mind. But then it looks like there's just a step that looks like something like arbitrary choice to the belief, right? It looks like an act of free will, liberium arbitrio, right?
Right.
That's taking you from the belief, from the absence of belief to the belief.
Right.
And I mean, of course, there's a history of there are people who say you can't believe it will, but there's a history too.
Sure. Yes.
Of saying that you do believe it will, right?
Yes,
Going back to Descartes and before.
Yeah.
And the making up your mind talk can sound like, I mean, especially if you think of the case where you make up your mind to do something, right?
Yes. Okay, good. I mean, maybe I should stop and let you take the next.
John?
Just, I think my point, or the question is very similar to what Michael was raising, which is, I mean, it seems, maybe I haven't understood, but it seems to me that whoever's using the phrase, I mean, the phrase I've heard, making up your mind, seems often to be deployed by people who would like the conclusion of a theoretical syllogism to have the same sort of oomph that the conclusion of a practical syllogism does. It just concludes in an action. Mm-hmm. And then the question I think you're raising is, well, what act is that when you get to the theoretical side of it? I think it's a really good question and that you're raising. And I think that, whether something has a kinetic structure or not, I mean, it isn't going to solve that problem. I mean, that there's, something can have a kinetic structure where, there's activity of a very unproblematic sort through a lot of it, but then the terminating moment of the kinesis is something that looks awfully passive. I mean, so then the question is, well, okay, if there is spontaneity in this last step, even though it's a kinesis, well, what is it? What does it consist in? And the fact that it's the end product of a kinesis doesn't seem to answer that question. I think that's the one at least that's one of the questions I hear you raising. I don't know whether if that's right or not.
Yes, thank you. I would like to understand how cognition itself is spontaneous, not merely the progress toward cognition.
That's right.
As I understand what John has pointed out, he's pointed out that there's a reading of the language of activity, making up your mind, in his earlier 1994 invocation of it, where there is a proposive activity there. So, I mean, again, I repeat, I really the figure I'm criticizing is my inner McDowell, not John, right? I had an interpretation of this, and one of the constraints on it was that it was to be an elucidation not merely of the capacity to set myself on the path toward cognition, but to know. And that was the thing that I can't find an account of in the proposive activity that I admit there can be. I don't know.
Stephanie?
I have two remarks concerning your claim that synthesis is essentially self-conscious. The first is that I think that many people in this room, they all think it's obvious that synthesis is essentially self-conscious, but I would say there are several textual remarks in Kant where he say synthesis isn't essentially self-conscious. For example, in the metaphysical deduction, he says synthesis is the effect of imagination, and we are only very seldomly conscious of it. And in the A deduction, in the synthesis of recognition and concept, he says that even though whenever there's synthesis, there has to be consciousness. This consciousness can be very weak in the sense that we don't have to be conscious of the activity of synthesis, but are only conscious of the result of the activity of synthesis. So I think that's it's not so clear that for Kant synthesis is essentially self-conscious.
Yes. Yeah.
And the other thing is that I had the impression when, in the end, the way you explain what it means to synthesize, or especially what it means to judge, even according to your own explanation, it doesn't seem to be right to say that synthesis or judging is essentially self-conscious, because what you say is that to judge, that P means to consciously take the combination of certain representations to be required, and then you say, that's on page 25 in the last paragraph, given that taking this combination of representations to be required is tantamount to judging, that S is P, a subject who consciously takes the combination S is P to be required and to understand what is to judge will be in a position to know that she herself judges that P. So I think that seems to be a weaker claim than to say that judging is essentially self-conscious. At least, I mean, I always understood if you say judging is essentially self-conscious, that sounds as if you would say as long as there isn't self-consciousness, there's no judging. And here you just, I mean, according to this sentence, you could imagine a person who consciously takes the combination of representation to be required, but she doesn't understand what it is to judge, so she's not self-conscious. So I had the impression your own position is weaker than to say that it's essentially self-conscious.
Yes, thanks. Right. I mean, you have my own position, my position. Right. Here's how I got led to talk about essentially self-conscious in the way that I did. Right. I mean, I take it that many people read, for instance, the B 131, 132 passage. Must be possible for the I think to accompany all of my representations as something one could summarize by saying that our power of cognition is essentially self-conscious. Given the phrasing of the passage, that cannot mean that every representation is actually accompanied by the I think. It rather states something about the character of our representing that makes it possible for it to be accompanied by the I think. So when I use essentially self-conscious, I'm trying to use it in that spirit, as stating something about the nature of the relevant acts of representing, which makes them such that, if we reflect, self-conscious is unproblematically available. Right. So we need to distinguish between, as there were, two uses of self-conscious, one to characterize the nature of the power and the other to characterize particular acts. Right. The nature of the power is that it is essential to its nature that it is self-conscious in the sense that it is such as to, on reflection, be capable of accompanying its representations with the I think. Not every representation is so accompanied. And it's that distinction that I would invoke, I think, to try to deal with these remarks about the synthesis of imagination, right? I would take it that when he says we're hardly ever conscious of them, that what he's saying is not that we are incapable of bringing them to consciousness, but that we have not, in fact, made them clear and distinct, right? I mean, I'm vaguely remembering the footnote on clarity in the first critique. You know, it has been infinitely many degrees down to vanishing, right? I'm thinking that what is interesting is not the degree of actual consciousness, but the character of the representation in virtue of which, whatever its actual degree is, it is such that it can be brought to reflective consideration. Now, it may be, I mean, I'm worried that maybe the people in response to this are going to reduce further passages in which the imagination is said to be incapable of knowing certain of its most basic synthetic acts. But I don't... we'll see. We'll see what people
Robert?
Yeah. Gosh, it's so long ago I put my hand up, I forget what well, this is a series of wouldn't you agree kind of questions.
Ending in humiliation.
Understand your position and my position. I mean, let's say that the doctrine of the spontaneity of the intellect of Kant in the first critique is supposed to be, I mean, maybe it's too obscure, but not a metaphysical doctrine, but a logical doctrine. That's to say, reason to be reason, that thinking is an active power. And the active power it is such that it's self-determinate. All that means is what it is to have a judge, to judge, is to judge not for anything other than because of the merits of the judgment. It's spontaneous in that sense. So let's put aside the question of the consciousness of synthesis and sensible intuitions and just concede that judging, believing, acting are exercises of powers that are tied in some way to reason. Now, wouldn't you say that's true? Well, that's number one.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, maybe.
Can I get off the boat here?
Yeah.
I mean, he says in the logic lectures, I mean, the Escher ones, that there are two ways of characterizing the difference between the sensibility and understanding, and one is logical, right? The one represents singularly, right? The other represents generally. The one that represents with intuitions, the other with concepts. And the other is metaphysical, and the metaphysical one is perceptive versus spontaneous. So no, it's not a mere logical, at least not in any Kantian usage of that.
Well, by mere logical, I just mean it's not freedom of the will. It's not.
I agree. It's not freedom. Freedom of the will is a special case of spontaneity,
right.
not the generic.
So,
case.
In your view, what is the specialness of the spontaneity of thinking?
I don't think that there is a specialness of the spontaneity of thinking. So thinking is the generic case of spontaneity in this usage. I'm sorry. Am I misunderstanding the?
Well, it's acting is thinkingly done.
Yes.
But when the activity is judging, what is the distinctness of the spontaneous nature of judging, according to you?
I see. So theoretical.
You don't need to make any metaphysical commitment to characterize thinking as spontaneous if it means the exercise of our rational power, which is inherently self-determined, not determined by anything else. You know, if you have a belief because you're afraid that somebody will find out you don't have it, you don't have a belief. That's not a belief. You could tell yourself that, but you don't believe SSD. Well, all right. So that's first point. A couple more than one. Me anyway. So there are these activities like judging, believing, and acting that are apperceptive, or they're apperceived. Now, what would you say to the claim that your characterization in your recent answer to Stephanie is too weak? I mean, it's not a judgment of mind that S is P unless I judge that S is P. And I'm not judging that S is P unless I'm aware that I'm judging. What would it be to judge that S is P and not be aware that I'm judging? To believe that S is P and not be aware that I'm believing? Even more dramatically, to be acting intentionally and not to be aware that I'm acting. I mean, wouldn't we have to say that judging is essentially apperceptive, not potentially? Not that it has a capacity to be brought to. I mean, and in that case, then apperception and activity are two sides of the same coin. We don't get from one to the other or the other to the first. Just what it is to understand judging is for it to be a judging of mind, which can't be a judging of mind unless I'm aware. I'm judging. Now, the key difficulty is that the awareness that I'm judging is not a first-order dyadic intentional relation. That I'm not judging that I'm judging. I'm not internally perceiving that I'm judging. What it is to be judging, just as it is what it is to be acting, is to be conscious of myself judging and acting. And that means it's connected to the order of reason. I can't be judging or believing unless it's connected to the acting, which comes back to the more logical meaning of spontaneous. It's got to be in the order of reason for it to be judging and acting, and I've got to be aware of having placed myself, all metaphorically meant, in the order of reason to be judging or acting. That's number two. Number three is, now how do we handle what I think was the most interesting part of John's response to you? What do we say? Because I'm with you on the general point about apperception and activity, and I don't like the mere capacity bit, but I'm with you on the big picture. But now what do we say about sensible intuition, which seems to involve synthesis without apperception? I mean, couldn't we say that there are synthetic activities that the mind is engaged in, for example, activities of the imagination, which operate by principles of association, that aren't judgments? Namely, in some sense or other, they happen. They're not in the order of reason. They're not spontaneous. But they're activities of a different category because they're not in the order of reason, but it's perfectly all right that they're in that category. We don't have to answer how, because we're distinguishing between the synthesis that makes up judgment in the order of reason and the synthesis that makes up the imaginative associations that just go on. Wouldn't that be fine? Don't you think?
There's a lot in that.
I miss Sebastian, so I decided to channel Sebastian.
Yeah. Well, you're channeling yourself too. I mean, I should say that the Henry Allison paper, takes its central idea from Robert's paper.
I'm glad somebody finally saw it.
Well, he says so. He says so. He footnotes it. Right, because it should be. Yes, the font should be bigger. I don't myself find it obvious, independent of questions of Kant interpretation, that you only judge if you're aware of judging. I find the following very attractive. You only judge in as much as you consciously take certain representations as to be combined. Right? But it seems to me a further step to go from that awareness of the representations as to be combined to a distinct representation of myself as the one who combines them. Now I think there's basis.
It's not an awareness of myself. It's not an inner perception. I'm trying to rule that out of court.
So good. I mean, there you name a position that I would like to hear clarified, and that in a way, you could think of my endeavor as trying to clarify. Right? It's not that I'm against it in spirit, but that I think once you say this, look, don't think of representing yourself as judging. Think of an awareness that is not that. Right? You've said negatively what your position is, but you haven't said positively.
It is the activity of judging. It is the activity of acting. And that's what it is to be acting.
Well, not everyone finds that so clear. I mean, in a way, that was we shouldn't win our case through italics.
The point was you're asking me to say, tell me the two poles of the intentional relation. I'm saying, I don't. It's not that. And
yes,
you're saying, well, then I don't understand you. give me the two poles. And I'm saying, you haven't understood what I said.
No. It's if somebody says, if I say, is it in the living room or the kitchen, and you say it's in neither, right? Then if I say, well, where is it? I don't necessarily say, well, which of the living room or the kitchen is it in? No, I say, well, tell me something else.
Not know you're in the living room. How can you be acting and not know that what you're doing is acting?
I do it all the time.
I don't mean consciously intending.
Yes, good. You do not mean. Yes, right. I mean, I would like. Yes, so Robert, there's no deep disagreement here. Although I think there may be a disagreement about. Can I come to one other thing that you said? Yeah. The issue about synthesis. You were envisioning a synthesis of the imagination that is associative. I think Kant may use synthesis for that kind of thing on occasion. But it looks like in section 15 of the B deduction, right, synthesis is introduced as the name for the act that constitutes combination, right, which is said to be a kind of representation that can only be an act of spontaneity. Right, so when I was talking about synthesis, I was talking about that. If there's some more general idea of synthesis, such that it can be merely associative, non-combining, the considerations that I brought to bear don't apply to it. I agree. So, but I think that when we say that the same function that I forget the phrase. It constitutes the unity of the several representations in a judgment. Gives unity to several representations in a judgment. Also gives unity to the manifold of representations in an intuition. Right. That is the synthesis in the sense of section 15 of the B deduction. And so John is right to say if there are general things to say about synthesis in that sense, they should apply to that synthesis.
Yeah. I'll stop after this. What characteristic of them uniquely makes it, in your view, then possible to say they can become objects of awareness? I mean, we could sort of intend to the perceptual events that are happening as inner episodes. I mean, what is it about them that makes them
take drawing a line, right? I mean, some of drawing a line, I suppose, is a paradigm of sensible synthesis, right? Or meant to be something through which we can think about, what sensible synthesis is in a tangible case, right? Were to envision me doing this with a view to constituting a line, I suppose, with a view to adding ever further elements to a growing manifold of points, right? I have a point of view on that act that is the point of view of the agent of it. Yeah. And to that extent, it's generically like, I think, the relationship I have to the synthesis of concepts in judgment, although there are further things to say about one of the syntheses that one would not say about the other.
That seems to me like saying, in drawing a line and constructing a figure in mathematics, for example, I, in some sense, the point of viewpoint is what I'm interested in, take myself to be drawing a line, not to be doodling, not to be imagining.
It's not that I take myself, it's that I take a line as to be drawn.
By me.
Well, the latter is expressed in my drawing, but not reflected in my representing. So we need that some distinction like that. Yeah.
Michael?
I think this is just a follow-up to Robert, but in more Sellarsian terms, right? Since Sellars is at least a nominal presence here. The master thought
the real presence, Michael.
I mean, well, I don't know. You can't see Jesus as the bread and wine. But the master thought of it as philosophy of mind, as John describes it. In characterizing a state as one of knowing, we are not giving an empirical description. We are placing it in the logical space of reason, justifying it, being able to justify what one says, right? What's the master thought there? Well, with respect to spontaneity, it's the difference between human knowledge and animal cognition parallels the difference between human action and animal behavior, in that in the human case, accountability is the key concept. We are responsible in the sense of accountable for what we believe, in the way that are closely analogous to those in which we're accountable for what we do. Now, you've already got the capacity for self-consciousness implied by that, because you cannot be held accountable for that which you are incapable of acknowledging, either as your beliefs or by virtue of answering the Anscomian why question, what are you doing? I mean, unless that is present, you're not acting, you're not believing. That's Sellars' way of making Robert's point. Now, in terms of these confusions you point out, and the Coast Guard quote, I think, is quite a good one. When you see how close knowledge and action are in that respect, there's a tendency to make a fatal move, which is precisely to say this. But look, you can only be held accountable for things you do. But believing isn't something you do. So how on earth can you be accountable for it? And Sellars, I think, has just the right answer to this question, where he says that not all norms or rules are ought-to-dos. There are ought-to-bes. And Sellars makes just, in Science and Metaphysics, and elsewhere makes just John's distinction. Mental acts are not typically mental activities. There are mental activities. Racking your brains is a mental activity. There are things you can do in order to help you make up your mind, collect evidence, take a second look, do this. But the believing that comes at the end of those processes is not an extra action tacked on. As Robert says, it wouldn't be believing if it were. I mean, even when you investigate the Syria thing, maybe you'll find out, you read a lot of arguments in op-eds, and eventually perhaps you'll find one side of the case more convincing. You don't decide to find the preponderance of the evidence more convincing. It doesn't even make any sense. I mean, it wouldn't be to be convinced if it were like that. So, how can you be accountable, you might think? Well, Sellars says, because ought-to-be rules are rules of criticism. The processes that take place, and, the involuntariness is neither here nor there. I mean, if I say something, you say, that's stupid, I can't say, maybe I've been to too many Cox-Sci classes. I can't say, don't blame me, my subpersonal processes made me do it. I mean, that's no answer to the question. They're rules of criticism, Sellars says, ought to be. So, it's true, when you form a perceptual belief, there's nothing voluntary about it, but it matters that the conditions of perception were propitious for the exercise of your perceptual or recognitional capacity, that you were there long enough, that the light was good, that there weren't various distorting factors. That matters. When you collected the evidence and then found it convincing on one side, it matters whether the evidence you collected was as much relevant evidence as really perhaps could have collected. All that matters. And so when someone says, well, wait a minute, you shouldn't say that, because now that engages with an ought to do. Yes. Maybe have a rethink, get some more, see how you feel given the new evidence that your interlocutor has provided, or maybe stop saying something because it was turned out that the conditions in which you came to believe it were not as propitious as you took them to be. So ought to be's are not disjoint from straightforward ought to do's. There are things you ought to do when an ought to be condition is violated. And that puts believing as much in the space of activity and reasoning as it needs to be to meet the accountability condition which it shares with action. And then when people like Kierkegaard say, well, there's a tendency to think, no, it can't be like that. You've got to be always exercising this capacity to distance yourself and ask yourself, why did I come to that? But that doesn't even make any sense. I mean, I don't know how to distance myself from my current conviction that you and I are in this room talking about Kant or something. Short of crazy skeptical hypotheses, which I've discussed ad ultra nauseam and have no intention of revisiting ever. Unless forced. And I think this is what John said at the very beginning of Mind and World in 1994, that this was the important sense in which this spontaneity was involved in judgment, that it was in the space of reasons and not simply the space of causes, which naturalistic reliabilism, which is all over contemporary philosophy of mind and epistemology, completely loses sight of.
Michael, should we let Matt answer?
Yes, okay. Anyway, so it's just my Sellarsian rant, I'm sorry. But when you clearly
All right, Matt, the floor is yours.
Well, it sounded like you were representing the puzzlingness of the application of the idea of activity to theoretical cognition as arising solely from a pig-headed assumption that the only way you can be active is by choosing, willing, doing in the sense of related to the practical. I don't think that's the case. First of all, I think the idea of the application of the idea of spontaneity to theoretical cognition is intrinsically puzzling, apart from any unnecessary assumption like that. And one way to bring it out is by saying that the ought to be point doesn't suffice to mark out the thing that we want to mark out. I don't think. I mean, I take it that all kinds of states can be subject to ought to be norms about which we would not want to say that the states are in any sense acts, spontaneous acts of a subject. I mean, consider the cognition of a creature that is not a rational creature, right? I mean, sometimes it will represent well and sometimes poorly. When it represents poorly, it will be in violation of an ought to be. I take it. What?
I don't.
Okay. Well, then you're using a notion of ought to be that is restricted to the case that I want to understand, and that I would want to understand as much as I would want to understand the topic that I am officially trying to investigate. That's all right. I mean, we will only say ought to be in this kind of case. What are we marking exactly? Are we merely marking the fact that the subject can, if he becomes conscious of standing in violation of one of these things, take steps in respect of himself that bring the relevant state into conformity? That seems not to capture the intimacy of the idea that cognition is an act of spontaneity. Our cognition is an act of spontaneity. It allows acts of spontaneity in the vicinity of our cognition, but it does not make knowing itself, judging, combining representations, an act of spontaneity. So I was inspired by the Kantian thought that is an act of spontaneity, and trying to make sense of it. I think it has a certain appeal, not only in the interpretation of Kant, but at large. it seemed to me that to make sense of that, I didn't want to dispute the things that figured in the Sellarsian rant, but I felt the desire to say more.
It's a Kantian thought, though, the Sellarsian rant. And this is the difference with animals. It's the difference between acting in accordance with a rule and acting for the sake of a rule. I mean, animals no doubt act in accordance with more or less reliable cognitive processes. If they didn't, they would go extinct. They've been shaped by evolution to develop. But in the case of us, I take it, this is where again at least some element of self-consciousness and perception comes in. When someone says things weren't as they ought to be, the lighting wasn't very good, or the evidence that so-and-so gave you was misleading, I have to be capable of acknowledging the validity of the criticism. Animals, you can assess their performances, but there's a sense in which you don't assess them in the way that you assess a human subject. And I take it there's a way in which we don't assess very small children, either for their cognitive performances or for what they do. Do you think that
those facts about how we assess are primitive, or do you think that something about the nature of the relevant cognitive powers explains the rightness of those?
I think that way of asking the question is something we shouldn't do. That precisely blurs the distinction between epistemology and psychology that Kant taught us not to blur, and that Sellars, tried to reteach the 20th century not to blur. The epistemic questions are normative questions. They're questions about entitlement, validity, justification. And when you say, well, is this a question about the cognitive powers? I don't want to ask that question. It's a question that epistemic, or that was what Sellars said. He says not an empirical description, but placing in the logical space of reasons. Don't treat that. The word cognition, I think, is dreadful, particularly now because of the rise of so-called cognitive science. Because that phrase strikes me as designed to blur a distinction that should not be blurred between. There was that Frege told us not to blur when he revolted against psychologism. In what sense is logic the laws of thought? It's not the empirical description of thinking processes, that's for sure.
Okay. I mean, sorry. It sounds like the issues that we would dispute about go deep.
They do.
I mean, I agree. I mean, it's one of the great merits of Kant to have drawn a distinction between the quid juris and the quid facti.
Right.
Whatever he meant by drawing that distinction, it apparently did not, in his conception of the matter, rule out talking about the several faculties of cognition and the roles that they play in making cognition possible in their natures. Right. I mean, and I just profession of faith. I mean, this is all. Right. I mean, although I do not want to deny the normative propositions that you want to affirm, I would like to understand that about what is that makes it possible for those norms to be sound. Right. I don't think that's necessarily a conflation of I don't know what, epistemology with psychology or whatever. Not just any being would be appropriately subjected to these forms of accountability. We can ask in a principled way, what kind of being would, using the disputed Kantian principle, what implies can or something like that. We can ask, what are the powers that would make right these forms of accountability, assessment, etc. And that's what, I guess it's in that business that I'm working.
I don't think we can clear this up. The questions are too deep, but it might be just, we're, marking the space of the discussion. I mean, I'm certainly very sympathetic, as I think Kant probably is, to the thought that, there's certain kinds of normative issues. There's certain merely empirical psychological issues, and one will misunderstand the one by identifying them with the other. But there's a kind of way in which, after Frege, that distinction is turned into a kind of dichotomy. I mean, one thing can be, if you don't have the distinction sharp, you're just blurring things. But another possibility with respect to certain issues is, if the dichotomy is too sharp, you actually can't see something if it's, if the only possibility is it has to fit clearly into one box or the other. And I think often, it looks like a way of summarizing that distinction between the logical and the psychological to say something like the descriptive or the prescriptive. And then, if you take that dichotomy, it's just going to seem really confused. Because, two more sentences. Because on the one hand, he clearly has something like the quick juris, quick facie description, but he is interested in, as it were, characterizing the powers of our mind. And then it looks like, then that looks like it's descriptive rather than prescriptive. But I think there is room for an idea. Whether it's useful or not is another matter, but just to get it into view requires that those aren't only two options. There's room for an inquiry, and we think, what we're doing is not empirical psychology. It's a priori. What we're characterizing is a power. How it adheres or is exercised by a subject is another matter. There is something like the healthy functioning of that power. That gives us a certain kind of standard. So in characterizing the power, we're doing something that has a descriptive task, but it itself gives us a standard, so it has a normative aspect. It's not just one or the other. And that the grasp of that can then allow us to see various things. And, if that's the conception of what investigating cognitive powers, it has nothing to do with cognitive psychology. Now, it might be, once we split things into only these two options, and then the word cognitive comes back to analytic philosophy on one of those two sides, and then we read Kant, we hear the word cognitive as, on that side of the dichotomy, but that would be a feature of our intellectual provincialism. I think from Aristotle to Kant, the investigation of cognitive powers, I don't think is going to be usefully located on one half or the other of a prescriptive, descriptive antinomy.
Jim, I'm not, just so that people don't run away with the idea I'm quite that simple-minded. I've written many papers about how reliablest insights with respect to reliability considerations of basic cognitive faculties can be taken up into rational discussion. I mean, that there's no simple, it's the one or the other there, in my view. But, nevertheless, I do stand by the idea that I forget Kant for the moment. When Matt talks about confusion in a lot of contemporary philosophy of mind, then I would add and epistemology. I think the diagnosis I gave is pretty much the right one. And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, let's move on to your view. Okay.
Introduce myself. I'm an Italian listening student. I apologize in advance for my English. And I almost got questions. So, I really appreciated your paper, and I agree with your interpretation of the relation between spontaneity and we can say structural possibility of consciousness in the transcendental deduction. And but I have some doubts about the conclusions. Mm-hmm. I think that even if it's true that the awareness in play in the transcendental deduction is an agential awareness, and that according to Kant, most of our judging is unconscious in some sense and automatic. I think that it's also important in Kant the possibility to step back and to suspend the judgment, for instance. And he often talks about the anticipatory judgments, judicial previa, and the critique itself is a Beurteilung, so maybe without this capacity could that not be written. But the point is that I want to choose an empirical example, an example at the empirical level that we can find in the critique. The proposition the rising moon is bigger than the rising moon is not bigger, even if it seems to be bigger.
Yes. Okay.
Well, at the end of your paper, you make room for determinate stances about how things fit together. But in order to explain the possibility of this proposition, I think that we should make room also for a spectatorial kind of awareness and related to a specific theory. And so maybe it could be important for the discussion to try to clarify the Kantian distinction between Urteilen, Setzen, and Fürwahrhalten, because this distinction is not so clear. It seems to me not so clear in your paper. Also because you say that belief for Kant is a species of judgment, but actually is a species of Fürwahrhalten. And I don't know if you translate or
holding
mine
true or something.
belief.
Yeah, taking to be true. Yeah.
And they are related but different.
Sorry, what I said was that I believe he glosses Fürwahrhalten as the subjective validity of judgment. Mm-hmm. Right. So the point in the context of the paper was this, that belief is defined in terms of holding to be true. Holding to be true, in turn, is defined as it were the subjective aspect of judging, while the subject holds open the question, whether he's objectively grounded in holding to be true in this way. And the point in the context of the paper was just this, that if that's right, then judging for Kant is not a momentary settling on an opinion, but something that might be exhibited in what he calls believing, Glauben. So that was, But sorry, I mean that's not the core of your question. I think
the point was about the empirical illusion, the veridical illusion, for instance. In that case,
what is the core of it seemed to be the thought that I should leave room for some spectatorial relationship. I don't quite grasp yet the thing that I meant to leave room for, but I don't doubt that there are lots of senses in which it might be valuable to think of us as spectators when we judge. The only thing I was trying to point out was this, that Allison, following Robert, glosses the activity of judging in terms of the following thought. Judging is taking as, and taking as has the following property. You only take X to be F if you're aware of taking X to be F. I think that requirement is not sufficient for active consciousness. One way to see that is by considering the plausibility of a similar principle in the case of pain, right? You're only in pain insofar as you're aware of being in pain, right? It's attractive. Not everybody will deny it, will agree to it, but even the people who do agree to it won't suppose that pain, in virtue of this fact about its relation to apperception, is an active an awareness of my determining myself, right? It's an awareness of being determined, right? So what I take that to show is that Allison's apperception principle does not sufficiently characterize the relationship to our own judgments in virtue of which they are acts. Yeah, okay. So if you'll grant me that we are not spectators in respect of our judgments in whatever sense it is that's at stake in that point, then I will grant you whatever further spectatorial relations you want. Yeah. Mark.
Okay, so the disagreement is getting clearer to me. So we've got a thin normative sense of spontaneity that Sellars, Williams, Lance, and I think maybe Pippin sense, where that is fully captured by
what you're responsible for, the kinds of ways you can be evaluated, the practices of responding to those evaluations, yada, 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 all of that stuff. There's other questions about what it would be to be competent at that, which are some of the kinds of questions Jim was asking. I take it you want a much thicker sense of spontaneity, whereby the judging is actually an action, a doing, in some stronger sense that goes beyond however much of that you would say. Now, I'll just register, I just think the right thing to say is no, it's not. I just think it's a chimera you're shooting for. But my question
Fichte has this thing where, like, when people say certain things, then he says, well, I don't have to talk to you anymore because you're obviously not cognizing.
Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just, but let's suppose we want the stronger thing that you want. I don't get what your way of getting it is. So I take it the rubber hits the road on page 24, and you say, here's this sentence that seems to me to be where the magic happens.
Where the magic happens.
All right. About near the end, the second to last sentence, I guess. The point is not merely that judging at SSP necessarily involves being aware of judging at SSP. It's that judging that SSP necessarily involves taking a specific combination of S and P to be required, and thereby being aware of determining one's own judgment. Now, if the being aware of determining one's own judgment is supposed to be in this stronger sense, this agential, action-y, correlative doing something sense, then I don't see why the and thereby is warranted. So two things, like I see sort of how, I gather I understand that if I judge that the cup is white, I'm judging that cup and white properly go together, that anyone would be entitled to putting those together, that if I said it's just true for me, you could say, oh, you're not really judging then. I get all of that. But why does that make my doing a doing in this thicker sense than what Michael was talking about? In some sense, how could it possibly? Because basically you said, okay, so the point is not merely that you're aware of judging the SSP, you said you're judging this extra thing. But if there's a question about how one judging is sufficiently agential, then saying, well, no, you've actually got two judgings. You've got both the one judging and the judging that judging is required. How could that make it more agential? It just seems like couldn't help with the project that you think you have to carry on with.
Well, let me say several things. First of all, I dispute that Michael and you and whoever else is in this boat have identified a clear sense of activity which is weaker than mine, and which we could be perfectly satisfied with if mine collapses. I think you guys have identified a practice of treating people as if they're active.
I don't call it as principle of activity. I'd be happy to lose the word.
Well, okay, well, all right. Sorry.
I think it's what happens when you believe. You're in the space of reasons. I think it's totally misleading.
You're in the space of reasons.
Doing. Believing is not doing something. That's just a mistake.
Of course, it's not doing something in that. If you're reserving that for. Look. Here's the Kantian view. Cognition, in as much as it's an act of the understanding, involves an act of a self-determining power, right? That is to say, this is a specific kind of power, right? There are lots of, powers that are not self-determining, right? I use active for that general property, and I following Kant, I take action in the sense of the thing that we do in practical life to be a special case of that, but not the general case.
Okay.
I'm seeking to elucidate this idea of a self-determining power.
Right.
Now, so you just throw up your hands at that, but I don't know. Look at what you do. I mean, you go to your friend. I mean, who holds some view that you think is unwarranted, and you say, you can't believe that. You shouldn't, right? You hector, and it's not merely that you think henceforth, you should go about changing that. You want to criticize the guy even now, right?
He's bad. Yes.
Yes, and tell me about this. I mean, somehow, when the plant dies, we don't criticize it in the same way,
No, absolutely not.
And all right, I mean,
the plant can't talk to me.
Yeah, I mean, if talking were a certain sort of thing, then I don't see why this criticism would be warranted, even if there were talking. I mean, suppose the plant could, make noise. I don't know.
There's a lot less to say. But look. I mean, I understand that you want to root all of the practical normative things that Michael and I are talking about in a power. I think that's a fundamentally mistaken methodological approach, but I'm not trying to convince you of that. All I'm saying now is, how could your move of saying that the judgment's got...
I was going to come back to that.
It's got a conjunct get you that. I mean, in a sense, the only way I'm going to beat you is I'm going to keep listening to everything you try to say to make good on that power talk, and I'm going to criticize every single instance. This is my strategy.
You're going to shame me.
And eventually you're going to say that's a degenerating research program. That's my hope. I can't give you a proof that there isn't a power answer to all of this stuff.
I see. Well, we'll see who has the degenerating research program.
You might, but at my age, I probably won't.
But anyway, at any rate, I think this is just an epicycle.
Did you want to respond to the...
I do. I would like to respond to the substance of the point. I mean, so consider the contrast between awareness of pain and awareness of judgment, right? In awareness of pain, there is an awareness accompanying the condition, right, necessarily, I'm tempted to say, but it is a passive kind of awareness, right? It is a passive awareness, it's an awareness of the condition, not as one that I, through being aware of it, ground, but one where my awareness is part of a passion, an undergoing, right? What I was trying to do was just to bring out the character of judging that contrasts with that, right? In judging, I think...
But you made an argument for it. You said because it's a judgment of requiredness, it's therefore active and self-determining. And that's what I don't know. I could perfectly receptively say, oh shit, I've got to go save that person. I mean, I didn't determine that. How does putting the content of requiredness...
Sorry, let's focus.
Let's
focus on the. I'm thinking the following: that we've got to stick with one case. So let's stick with just judging the P.
Yep.
Right. I shouldn't say P, right? I mean that S is P, right? I mean to be Kantian, right? So here's my standpoint on so judging. I take it to be required of any power of judgment that it combine S and P thusly. Mm-hmm. That is judging, right?
Okay. I'll give you that. Why does that make it a self-determining action?
Because the consciousness, the consciousness of the fact of judgment is founded in a consciousness of the requirement to judge, right? It contrasts in this what I think should be a striking way with the relation of pain to the apperception of pain, right? The pain is not known as required and thereby made so.
Oh, I agree. Okay. The requiredness distinguishes pain from belief. I'm asking why requiredness requires self-determining action. I can be required not to be in the lane for more than 3 seconds, but if I, fell down, it's... right? I mean, there's no necessary.
Sorry, we should stop.
No, you could have one last word.
It was not about requiredness per se. It was about the consciousness of requiredness and the relation between that consciousness and the fact obtaining that is required. That was the thought.
Okay, so unfortunately we're out of time. I apologize to those. So tomorrow, have another day, 10 o'clock, same place.
I mean,